Welcome my channel. Tonight's story uncovers a truth so dangerous it was never meant to be found. This is the forgotten account of She Kept the Plantation's Books, the enslaved girl who exposed the truth. Hidden inside ledgers, numbers, and quiet calculations was evidence that could destroy reputations, rewrite history, and expose crimes buried for generations. This story is based on real records, cross-checked documents, and deep research that took serious time to uncover. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and make sure you subscribe, because finding true data like this, separating fact from silence, takes real work, and your support keeps these stories alive. She was never supposed to learn numbers. On the plantation, knowledge was guarded more fiercely than money, because numbers meant records, and records meant truth. She was born into labor, not literacy, and from the day she could walk she was trained for work that left no paper trail, hauling water, cleaning floors, carrying messages that were meant to be forgotten the moment they were delivered. But fate has a way of slipping through cracks, and for her, that crack appeared in the form of a locked office and a careless overseer who underestimated a quiet child. She was barely 11 when she was first sent into the main house to dust shelves and scrub floors near the study. The room smelled of ink and old paper, a sharp contrast to the dirt and sweat of the fields. Ledgers sat stacked neatly on the desk, their spines worn smooth by years of use. She didn't know what the symbols inside meant at first, only that the white pages carried strange marks arranged in rows and columns, repeated with ritual precision. The plantation owner treated those books with more care than he did any human life on the property. That alone made them important. Her opportunity came through the owner's wife, a woman obsessed with order and appearances. The mistress believed numbers were neutral, harmless things, tools, not weapons. When illness struck the household clerk, the mistress needed someone to fetch books, copy figures, and sit silently while totals were read aloud. The girl was chosen because she was quiet, obedient, and, most importantly, invisible. At first, her task was simple: hold the ledger steady, fetch ink, keep pages clean. But repetition is a teacher, and she listened closely. She began to recognize patterns before she ever understood meaning. She noticed how certain symbols always followed others, how tallies grew and shrank, how dates lined up with shipments and punishments. At night, in the slave quarters, she traced numbers into the dirt with her finger, memorizing their shapes the way others memorized hymns. She didn't know their names yet, but she knew their power. Numbers decided how much food was issued, how many bodies were counted, how much profit came from how much suffering. The mistress, thinking herself generous, began to teach her basic arithmetic, not out of kindness, but convenience. "You'll save me time," she said, as if time were the only thing being spared. The lessons were whispered, informal, never acknowledged in front of others. Add this. Subtract that. Keep the columns straight. The girl learned quickly, not because she was gifted, but because she understood what was at stake. Every correct sum kept her near the books. Every mistake risked being sent back to the fields, back to silence. Soon, she wasn't just holding ledgers. She was updating them, recording inventory, copying totals, rewriting faded entries. The plantation owner trusted the numbers as long as they balanced, never questioning who held the pen. To him, she was a tool, not a mind. To the overseers, she was harmless. To the ledgers, she became a witness. What no one realized was that numbers don't lie, but they also don't hide. As she copied page after page, she began to understand what the columns truly represented. Names replaced numbers in her mind. Losses weren't crops, they were people. Gains weren't profits, they were stolen years of life. She saw figures rise after whippings, drop after outbreaks of sickness, spike after sales that were never spoken of aloud. The books recorded everything the mouths refused to say. Being entrusted with the plantation's books was never an honor. It was a mistake. The owner believed control came from ownership, not awareness. He believed literacy without power was harmless. He believed an enslaved girl could never understand the scope of what she was recording. But understanding crept in slowly, quietly, the way rot spreads through wood. She learned when to keep her face blank and when to lower her eyes. She learned how to memorize entries instead of writing them down twice. She learned that numbers could be rearranged, but truth left a residue. And most importantly, she learned that the books proved something undeniable. The plantation's public image was a lie. The ledgers told a different story, one of illegal sales, falsified counts, unpaid labor, and deaths quietly written off as loss. By the time she was fully entrusted with maintaining the books, it was already too late. She knew too much. She had seen too clearly. The plantation's wealth, its respectability, its standing in the community, all of it rested on figures that should never be questioned. And yet, every night she questioned them. She was still enslaved, still powerless in every visible way. But she carried something no one could take from her without knowing it existed: knowledge. And knowledge, once written, once understood, has a way of surviving even the most violent attempts to erase it. Once she understood how the numbers worked, the books stopped looking like harmless columns of ink. They began to reveal cracks, small at first, almost invisible, but impossible to ignore once she noticed them. Totals that didn't quite add up. Dates that repeated when they shouldn't. Names missing where names should have been. At first, she assumed she was wrong. She double-checked her work in secret, tracing sums in her head late at night, counting on her fingers beneath a thin blanket while others slept. Again and again, the math confirmed it. The books were lying. The first discrepancy she noticed was in the food ledger. According to the entries, rations had increased that season, supposedly due to a good harvest. But she knew the truth. She had watched the cooks stretch meals thinner than ever, had felt the same gnawing hunger as everyone else. The numbers claimed abundance. The bodies told another story. Someone was recording supplies that never reached the quarters. Someone was profiting from hunger, and the proof sat quietly on the page. Then there were the labor counts. Each month, a neat figure listed how many enslaved people were active. But the girl knew the faces behind those numbers. She knew who had died of fever, who had been sold south without warning, who had been beaten so badly they could no longer work. Yet the count barely changed. Sometimes it didn't change at all. Losses were erased, absorbed into margins, explained away with careful wording. A life vanished, but the number stayed the same. As she turned page after page, a pattern emerged. Deaths clustered around certain weeks, weeks that matched increased profits. Sales appeared without corresponding reductions in labor totals. Punishments were never listed, but medical expenses spiked right after nights. She remembered screams echoing across the fields. The books didn't describe violence. but they recorded its aftermath with brutal precision. Every lash left a shadow in the ink. What frightened her most was how deliberate it all was. These weren't careless mistakes. They were systematic adjustments, designed to present a version of the plantation that could survive inspection. If an outsider ever audited the records, everything would appear lawful, efficient, respectable. The ledgers were armor, and the truth was buried beneath layers of calculated arithmetic. She began to notice how certain entries were rewritten more than others. Pages replaced. Ink darker where someone had gone back to correct the past. On one occasion, she found a page torn out entirely and replaced with a clean copy, the handwriting tighter, more controlled. She recognized the owner's hand then. That was the moment she understood this wasn't just overseers padding numbers. It went all the way to the top. The most damning discovery came from comparing years. She wasn't supposed to have access to old ledgers, but sometimes she was sent to fetch them anyway, stacked in boxes, heavy with dust. When she lined them up in her mind, year against year, the lie became undeniable. Profits rose steadily even when crop yields fell. Labor counts stayed stable through years of sickness and punishment. The plantation appeared immune to loss. No place that brutal could be that clean. And then she found the column that wasn't meant to be understood at all. It was labeled vaguely, adjustments, small numbers, easy to overlook. But when she traced them across months, they added up to something enormous. They matched the value of people sold illegally, outside official channels. Sales that never went through records that authorities might see. Human lives converted into adjustments, reduced to quiet arithmetic. Every discovery tightened the danger around her. She realized she was holding proof of crimes that could destroy the plantation's reputation, possibly lead to investigations, maybe even punishment for powerful men. And she also realized something else. If anyone suspected she understood what she was seeing, she would not survive long enough to tell anyone. So she learned to hide her awareness. She corrected sums carefully, never questioning instructions. She copied false numbers as neatly as true ones. But she also memorized. She stored figures in her head, patterns in her memory. She counted the lies as carefully as she counted the totals. At night, she whispered numbers to herself, turning them into something no one could confiscate. The books had turned her into something dangerous, not because she wrote them, but because she could read between their lines. The plantation depended on silence, on the assumption that those forced to maintain the system could never understand it. The ledgers proved otherwise. They were supposed to conceal truth. Instead, they exposed it. What haunted her most was how calm the deception was. No anger in the handwriting, no hesitation, just smooth, confident entries that erased suffering with the same care used to tolly cotton bales. The realization settled heavily in her chest. The cruelty wasn't accidental. It was managed, accounted for, balanced. By the time she finished reconciling the books that season, she knew something irreversible had happened. The plantation's secrets were no longer abstract. They were precise, documented, undeniable. And she, an enslaved girl, never meant to understand numbers at all, had become the one person who could see the whole machine at work. The truth was there, inked into the pages, waiting. And once seen, it could never be unseen. Once she understood the discrepancies, the numbers stopped being abstract entirely. They became evidence. Each line in the ledger pointed to something real, that had happened in the shadows, things the plantation never intended to admit, let alone record. The deeper she read, the clearer it became that the books weren't just about crops and expenses. They were a quiet confession of crimes, written in a language only someone patient enough could decipher. One of the first truths the ledgers exposed was the scale of stolen labor. The plantation reported fewer working hours than were physically possible for the amount of cotton produced. The fields had been worked before sunrise and long after dark, yet the books listed standard days, modest output, reasonable margins. Someone had learned how to disguise exploitation as efficiency. The difference between what was recorded and what was lived revealed just how much unpaid labor was being siphoned off, transformed into profit with no trace of its human cost. Then there were the children. The books never listed births as increases in labor, only as future potential. But what shocked her was how often that potential disappeared without explanation. Infants appeared in one year's notes and were gone the next, replaced by small financial credits labeled as settlements or transfers. The numbers matched the going prices whispered about in secret. Children sold before they could even be named. The ledgers didn't say where they went, only that their absence had been monetized. Medical expenses told another story entirely. Whenever an overseer was injured, the costs were high and clearly detailed. When enslaved workers were hurt, the entries were vague, minimal, or missing altogether. Yet spikes appeared in burial supplies, wood, nails, cloth, quietly listed as maintenance. Death was recorded as upkeep. The books treated bodies as disposable inventory, something to be replaced, not mourned. The most dangerous truth lay in the punishment records that didn't exist. There were no entries for whippings, no line items for shackles, no mention of confinement. But the aftermath was there if you knew how to look. Productivity dipped suddenly after certain dates, then rebounded sharply. Medical supplies increased, then vanished. Food rations decreased while output increased. The ledgers didn't describe violence, but they relied on it. The math only worked if pain was part of the equation. She also uncovered proof of illegal dealings with neighboring plantations. Cotton shipments were listed as smaller than what left the property. The missing bales reappeared as private sales, routed through third parties. The profits never entered the main accounts. They were filtered through side ledgers, written in tighter handwriting, stored separately. These transactions funded luxuries in the big house, while keeping official records clean enough to withstand scrutiny. What terrified her most was realizing how intentional it all was. The plantation wasn't chaotic or careless. It was organized, methodical, and deeply aware of its own crimes. The books were designed to tell a convincing lie to anyone who didn't know how to read them properly. And yet, in trying to hide the truth, they had preserved it. She began to understand that the ledgers connected everything, labor, punishment, sales, death, into a single system. Nothing was accidental. Every act of cruelty had a financial echo. Every missing person left a numerical shadow. The plantation ran not just on forced labor, but on careful accounting of suffering. There were moments when the weight of it nearly broke her. Sitting alone with the books, she felt as though she were surrounded by voices no one else could hear. The pages were heavy with stories that had no other witness. She knew that if these records ever came to light, they would expose not just one plantation, but an entire way of life built on deception. And yet, she also knew the danger of that knowledge. The ledgers proved crimes that powerful people depended on remaining hidden. Anyone who could interpret them was a threat. She realized then that the books didn't just hold the truth, they put her life at risk. Awareness was dangerous. Memory was dangerous. Understanding was dangerous, so she became careful. She never reacted, never lingered too long on a page, never let her eyes show recognition. But inside, she catalogued everything. She remembered figures the way others remembered faces. She linked dates to events, numbers to names. The truth lived in her now, whether the books survived or not. What the plantation owners never considered was that control over information didn't end with the written word. They believed burning a page could erase a crime. They believed silence was enough. But the truth had already moved, from ink to memory, from ledger to witness. The books had exposed more than illegal practices. They had revealed the plantation's greatest weakness, its dependence on secrecy. And once secrecy cracked, even slightly, the entire structure stood on borrowed time. As the truth settled into her, the danger began to take shape, not as a single threat, but as a tightening circle. At first, nothing changed. The plantation moved as it always had, driven by routine and cruelty disguised as order. But she noticed things now that she hadn't before, the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, how overseers lingered a moment too long when she carried the books, how the owner's eyes followed the ledgers more closely than the people who worked the fields. Knowledge had made her visible, even if no one could yet name why. The first sign that suspicion was growing came quietly. One afternoon, she found the office door locked when it was never locked before. When it finally opened, the owner stood inside, pretending to rearrange papers that were already perfectly aligned. He asked her questions he had never asked before, not about the work, but about her. How long she'd been keeping the books, who had taught her numbers, whether she understood what she was writing. His tone was calm, almost gentle. But the questions were traps. She answered carefully, keeping her voice low, her eyes down, reminding him of what he wanted to believe, that she was useful, obedient, unaware. From that day on, the ledgers were watched. Pages were counted before and after she touched them. Corrections were made in front of her, not handed over. She was no longer left alone with the books for long stretches. The plantation hadn't accused her of anything, but accusation wasn't necessary. Control tightened without explanation, the way it always did when fear crept in. She understood then how fragile her position was. Being trusted with the books had been a convenience, not a right. And convenience could be withdrawn at any moment. If they suspected she could read the truth buried in the numbers, they wouldn't argue with her. They wouldn't warn her. They would erase the problem the way they erased everything else. The danger didn't only come from the owner. Overseers, too, had reason to worry. Their bonuses depended on inflated productivity. Their brutality was hidden behind falsified tallies. If the books ever spoke honestly, their power would crumble. She noticed how one overseer began standing closer than necessary when she wrote, his shadow stretching across the page, his hand resting on the handle of his whip. Another joked about how numbers were dangerous things in the wrong hands. They laughed when they said it. That was what made it frightening. Even the mistress changed. Once careless, she grew sharper, colder. She corrected the girl's posture, criticized her handwriting. found fault in sums that were perfectly correct. These weren't mistakes, they were tests. Pressure, applied slowly, to see if something would crack, to see if fear would reveal understanding. At night, the girl weighed every possibility. If the books were taken from her, she would lose access, but she would also lose protection. Being useful had kept her close to the house, away from the fields, away from random punishment. Knowledge had elevated her just enough to survive. Losing it could be fatal. Keeping it was dangerous too. There was no safe path, only choices between different kinds of risk. She realized that the plantation's greatest fear wasn't exposure to the outside world. It was exposure within. Inspectors could be bribed. Neighbors could be placated. But someone on the inside who understood the system was unpredictable. The truth didn't need to be shouted to be dangerous. Sometimes it only needed to exist. The pressure increased when rumors began to circulate. Quiet talk about missing pages, about numbers that didn't match older records. Someone had noticed. Maybe not her specifically, but the cracks were being seen. The owner began burning old ledgers at night, claiming they were no longer needed. She watched smoke rise behind the house and understood what it meant. They were destroying the past to protect the present. That was when she made her most dangerous decision. She stopped memorizing only figures. She began memorizing patterns. Who rewrote which pages? Which entries disappeared first? Which names never appeared at all? If the books vanished, the story would still exist in her mind, ordered and intact. Every day became a performance. She learned when to speak and when to stay silent, when to make a small mistake to appear ignorant, when to correct an error so they still needed her. She walked a narrow line between being indispensable and being disposable. The danger wasn't always immediate. Sometimes it was psychological, a sense of being watched, of footsteps stopping outside her door, of voices lowering when she passed. Other times it was sharp and sudden, an overseer's temper flaring without cause, a threat disguised as a warning, a reminder of what happened to those who overstepped. She understood then that the plantation wasn't just reacting to the truth, it was terrified of it. The books were the foundation of everything: profits, respectability, power. If those numbers were questioned, the entire structure could collapse. And she, an enslaved girl no one had thought twice about, had touched the heart of it. What made the danger unbearable was that she couldn't share it. There was no one she could warn without endangering them too. The truth isolated her. It sat heavy in her chest, unspeakable, unforgiving. She carried it alone, knowing that one wrong look, one careless word, could be her last. The plantation tightened its grip, not because the truth was out, but because it sensed it might escape. And in that tension, in that growing fear, she saw something else for the first time: vulnerability. The people who owned everything were afraid of a ledger, of a column of numbers, of what an enslaved girl now understood. The danger was real, but so was the crack she had found. And once a system built on secrecy begins to fear its own records, it has already started to unravel. The moment the records could no longer be hidden didn't arrive with shouting or confrontation. It came quietly, the way truth often does, through accumulation. Too many numbers that refused to align. Too many patterns repeating themselves across years that were supposed to be different. Too many erased names, leaving the same empty spaces behind. What had once been dismissed as minor inconsistencies had grown into something undeniable. something that could no longer be corrected with a stroke of ink or a torn page. It began with an inspection that was never announced. A business associate arrived from another county, claiming interest in purchasing land and reviewing output. This wasn't unusual, but what was different was the timing. He came during harvest calculations, when the books were most fragile, when last year's numbers sat uncomfortably close to this year's lies. The owner smiled and welcomed him, confident as ever, but the tension inside the house shifted immediately. Everyone felt it. The girl was told to bring the ledgers to the office. Her hands were steady, but her mind was racing. She already knew what he would see if he looked closely. She had seen it herself 100 times. Cotton yields that exceeded what the land could produce. Labor counts that didn't match burial records. Expenses that vanished when punishment increased. The books told a story the plantation didn't want told, and now there was an outsider close enough to hear it. At first, the owner attempted control. He hovered, explaining entries before questions were asked, redirecting attention to totals instead of details. He laughed off discrepancies as clerical habits, old methods, inherited confusion, but numbers don't argue, they wait. And the visitor wasn't careless. He ran his finger down columns, paused at repeated figures, asked why certain costs appeared every year without variation. Silence stretched where easy answers should have been. The girl stood nearby, invisible by design, yet central to everything. She watched the owner's confidence thin, watched his explanations grow longer, less precise, watched the moment when he realized that the books were no longer just tools, they were witnesses. Then came the question that changed everything. The visitor asked who kept the records. For a brief second, no one spoke. The owner hesitated, and in that hesitation the truth pushed forward. He could lie, but the handwriting was consistent across decades. He could claim oversight, but corrections bore the same careful marks. The books themselves answered before he did. When he gestured toward her, the room shifted again. The visitor looked at her, not with shock, but with curiosity. That was worse. Curiosity invited examination. Examination invited understanding, and understanding threatened exposure. She was asked simple questions. How long had she kept the books? Whether she understood what she was writing. Whether she noticed changes. Each question was a test, not just of knowledge, but of survival. She answered with restraint, never more than necessary, but enough to confirm competence. Enough to make it impossible to pretend the records were meaningless scribbles made by someone unaware. That was the moment the plantation lost control of its narrative. Not because the truth was fully revealed, but because it could no longer be contained. The visitor didn't accuse. He didn't need to. He closed the ledger slowly, the way someone does when they've seen enough, and said only that he would like copies of certain pages for further review. Panic followed, carefully masked. After the visitor left, voices rose behind closed doors. Pages were pulled, compared, whispered over. The owner demanded explanations from overseers who had none. The mistress ordered the girl away from the office, then called her back again, uncertain which was safer, distance or supervision. That night, fires burned again behind the house. More old records vanished. But this time, destruction felt futile. Burning pages didn't erase memory. It didn't erase the visitor's questions. It didn't erase the fact that someone outside the plantation now knew where to look. The next days were marked by damage control. Numbers were rewritten, totals adjusted, explanations rehearsed. The owner prepared letters in advance, excuses layered upon excuses, but the books resisted. Too many entries depended on one another. Change one figure, and 3 others collapsed. The system had been falsified for so long that it could no longer support revision. For the girl, this was the most dangerous period of all. Exposure didn't make her powerful, it made her vulnerable. She had become evidence. And evidence, in a place built on silence, was a liability. She sensed it in the way people avoided her gaze, or watched her too closely. In the sudden kindness that felt more threatening than cruelty. In the uncertainty of whether she would be punished, sold, or simply disappear. Yet something irreversible had happened. The truth had stepped beyond the plantation's boundaries. Even if consequences were delayed, even if justice never arrived, the illusion of control was broken. The books had done what they were always meant to do, record reality, not intention. The plantation could no longer pretend its numbers were private. They had entered a larger world, one governed by contracts, disputes, and eventually scrutiny. And at the center of that shift stood an enslaved girl who had been trusted with arithmetic, never imagining that simple honesty would become an act of defiance. The moment the records could no longer be hidden wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, but it was final, because once truth is seen, it doesn't return to silence. It waits, and sooner or later, it demands to be answered. The lasting impact of her knowledge did not arrive quickly, and it did not come in a way anyone could point to and say, "This is where it changed." It spread slowly, like something living beneath the surface, reshaping outcomes long after she was pushed out of sight. The plantation worked hard to erase her role, but erasure itself became proof that something dangerous had once existed there. In the months that followed the inspection, decisions were made that no one openly explained. A land deal quietly collapsed. A buyer withdrew interest without giving reason. An overseer who had been powerful for years was suddenly dismissed and sent away. These changes were attributed to circumstances, but those who lived on the plantation felt the shift. The confidence that once defined the household had thinned. Authority still existed, but it was brittle now, reactive instead of assured. The girl was removed from the book soon after. Not violently, not publicly, just reassigned. Another hand was brought in, someone who could copy numbers without understanding them. Someone safe. Officially, it was said that the workload had become too demanding for her. Unofficially, everyone knew the truth: she had seen too much. Knowledge had made her dangerous, and the safest way to neutralize danger was to bury it under routine. But what she had learned could not be taken from her. Even as she was sent back into labor, meant to exhaust and distract, the patterns remained in her mind. She remembered which names never appeared in records, which losses were hidden, which punishments had been disguised as expenses. The plantation believed it had reclaimed control, but control was an illusion now. The truth existed independently of the ledgers. Over time, that truth leaked out in fragments. Not through her directly, she was too closely watched for that, but through consequences. Financial pressure mounted. Debts surfaced that should not have existed. Legal disputes arose that forced explanations the owner struggled to provide. The plantation's reputation, once solid, became quietly questioned. No one accused it openly, but fewer people trusted its numbers. Fewer people accepted its claims without verification. What made the impact lasting was not exposure, but doubt. Doubt spreads faster than truth. Once people began to suspect that the books could not be trusted, everything built on them weakened. The plantation's authority relied on the appearance of order, of efficiency, of legitimacy. That appearance had been cracked by a girl who had simply written down what was real. History, however, did what it often does. When records were later reviewed, her name was absent. The ledgers bore no mark of who had kept them, only dates and figures. Official documents credited management changes, market fluctuations, or wartime instability. The truth was flattened into acceptable explanations. Her role was erased deliberately, not because it was unknown, but because it was unacceptable. Yet erasure is never complete. In private correspondence, hints remained. Letters referencing earlier inaccuracies. Notes about former methods no longer advisable. A repeated insistence on tighter oversight. These fragments pointed backward, even if they never named her. For those who knew how to read between lines, the story was still there. Within the enslaved community, her impact was quieter but deeper. People noticed that she had been treated differently, then removed. They noticed the tension that followed. They understood, without being told, that numbers could be dangerous. Knowledge became something to be respected, even feared. The idea that truth could exist in writing, and that writing could threaten power, took root. She herself carried the weight of knowing that she had changed something she would never be credited for. There was no reward, no recognition, no safety. Only survival. The system had not fallen. It had not apologized. But it had been forced to react, and reaction was evidence of weakness. Years later, when historians would try to reconstruct what happened on plantations like this one, they would rely on records that had already been filtered, corrected, and sanitized. They would argue over intent and accuracy. Some would accept the numbers at face value. Others would question them. And in that questioning, her influence would live on, even if her name never did. The truth she uncovered also shaped what could no longer be hidden so easily elsewhere. Plantation owners across the region began tightening record control, limiting who could read and write, restricting access even further. This wasn't confidence. It was fear. Fear that someone else might notice what she had noticed. Fear that the system was more fragile than it pretended to be. In this way, her knowledge outlived her presence. It forced adjustments. It left scars in policy and practice. It changed behavior. And change, even when small, is evidence of impact. The tragedy is that history rarely records those who expose truth from the margins. It records outcomes, not catalysts. It preserves numbers, not the hands that questioned them. Her story survives only indirectly, through inconsistencies that make researchers pause, through decisions that don't quite add up, through the sense that something was wrong long before anyone admitted it. She was erased because acknowledging her would have meant acknowledging the lie. And the lie was too large, too foundational, to confront directly. But the lasting impact of her knowledge is this: the plantation never fully recovered its certainty. And certainty is the first thing power needs. Once it's gone, everything else becomes harder to maintain. She didn't bring the system down. She didn't live to see justice. But she proved that even in a place designed to crush understanding, truth could still be found, and once found, it could never be completely destroyed.